Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Remember to subscribe to our free podcast so you won't miss any of our illuminating content. Here is episode 197.
So one of the best things I probably ever said or written is 2 words long, and here it is. Everything counts. If school and grades form the object and life is the field, then many things don't count. Unless it's school, it doesn't count. Trivia doesn't count. It's not on the test. But when you live without school or schoolishness, everything counts. In learning, in relationships, concerning integrity, everything counts.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Sandra Dodd. Sandra lives with her husband, Keith, in Albuquerque, a former public school teacher. She gave each of her 3 children the option to opt out of school and stay home. Over a 5-year window, each chose home. Sandra has been helping others understand unschooling since then. She has stayed with unschooling families in 8 countries, spoken at small and large events, and has written 2 books. With Just Add Light and Stir, Sandra has mailed a quote and a photo daily for nearly 7 years. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have Sandra on and talk about this really important topic of unschooling. It seems like it's gotten extremely popular, but I'm hoping she's going to help us with some myths and give us a better understanding of what unschooling looks like. But before we get into any of that, would you please tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Now I'm trying to think of what you didn't just cover. I was a teacher. Junior high English when I was younger in my hometown in Espanola, New Mexico, north of Santa Fe. Married my husband. We didn't intend to have children, and then we accidentally did, and we really liked it. And we said, if we had known it was going to be so great, we'd have done this sooner and had more. But we had 3, and the oldest will be 31 in July.
Oh, that's awesome.
The next one's 28, and the youngest is 25. My husband was an engineer and has retired a year or so ago. And so he and I are home, and our daughter, Holly, the youngest, is home lately for a while again. And we were involved in a medieval studies club, the Society for Creative Anachronism. My husband and my middle son still are. That's where I met my husband, singing madrigals.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. Well, and starting out as a public school teacher, how did you find the path to unschooling? And tell us how, you kind of found that mission and passion of what you're doing now.
A lot of years passed from the time I quit teaching to when I was unschooling. So those are related in a way, but one didn't lead to the other. When I was really little, when I was in 1st grade, I wanted to be a teacher. I loved my 1st grade teacher. She was nicer than my mom. Oh. And I started to figure out as I went to school, it wasn't very hard for a stranger to be nicer than my mom. So that's my personal disadvantage. But I just thought it was wonderful. I thought all of school and books and papers and words were just wonderful. So I wanted to be a teacher, and I did. I became a teacher. I taught for 6 years, and I quit before I was 30 years old. When I was teaching, though, I liked helping other teachers do things in more fun ways. And so I used to assume that probably eventually I would either be doing workshops or teaching education. It didn't happen, but that was what it felt like at the time, that I was leaning toward helping other people teach. What I liked really was not the teaching, but the learning, being around people who were learning. So what I do now developed gradually and naturally as I passed through other groups of people too, where people helped other people freely, that's how the group worked. And I helped too. People helped me, I helped them. In adult children of alcoholics meetings, which I went to for 3 years and a little more, and La Leche League. I went 4 years to that because I'm thinking about what the boys looked like. I went from before I was pregnant to when Marty could walk. Adult children of alcoholics, La Leche League, Cesarean Prevention Movement, which has a different name now, but moms helping other moms have to avoid a cesarean, to have a VBAC or vaginal birth. And that was all before I considered unschooling. So I already had that idea of parents helping other parents, adults helping other adults. So in my life, one of my favorite things is that people dream of doing something to change the world, and I've been able to do that a little bit, because when I help some families change their own worlds, that helps the larger world be a little better.
Wow. Well, and I kind of am interested in your story. You were talking about how you loved your teacher because she was nicer than your mom. And then, you waited a while to have children, and what a great blessing that was. But, how did you go from going, okay, well, I want my children, I love school so much, but now I want to have my children stay home and kind of opt out of school,
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
Well, I never had that thought, though. It didn't happen quite like that. It's hard to say. I just loved school. When I was a kid, I loved music. I loved music at church. I would go to church for music, kids choir, adult choir, the other churches' choirs. Anywhere I could be in a music group, I would go. And I loved music at home, and I loved words and books and trivia, writing, humor. I just loved making connections. And I graduated from the university early at 21 because I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to do it now. Uh-huh. So while some people say they never used anything they learned in college, I'm reminded all the time of things I learned, and I use those ideas all the time. My memories of school are really good. But when we had our son Kirby, he was 4. New Mexico had just recently made kindergarten mandatory at 5. His birthday's in late July. So school starts in August, and what happens is you can request to put it off for a year. And I knew about homeschooling because in my La Leche League group, there were 4 homeschooling families. So I knew a little bit about it, but I wasn't really thinking about it. I didn't see them homeschooling and think, gosh, that's what I want to do. But Kirby joined a dance class and it didn't go well, and he joined an art class and it didn't go well, but in 2 different ways. So I saw that and I thought, he's just not ready to go to school yet. It's not going to work well for him. Our choices were to either request a 1-year delay or to register to homeschool. If we homeschool kindergarten, the next year, our choice would be put him in kindergarten late, how are you going to fail homeschool kindergarten? But,
exactly.
Technically I was thinking, these are our options. Either we put him in first grade and say, okay, we homeschooled kindergarten, here he is, a first grader. That would have been an option. Or to keep him home. So I have never heard anybody else since then who had such a cushy beginning, such a totally risk-free intro to unschooling. So because we knew those other 2 families, the 2 other 2 unschooling families and 2 school-at-home families were in La Leche League with our family, and there was a babysitting co-op that had grown out of that, mostly leaders, and a playgroup. So it had about 20 families in it. Most of them were, normal mainstream went to school families, and 2 of them were school at home, one of them military, school at home, lots of rules. And then 2 of the families were unschoolers. When we were at the playgroup, those unschooled kids would come up to their parents and talk to them and show them things and ask them questions, and they would just climb up into their laps to get a hug, or the babies would come nurse, and then the parents were just sweet and kind. And the other 2 families, not so much. Oh, yes. So another thing about the babysitting co-op is my kids had been to almost all the other houses without me, and almost all those other kids had been to my house without their parents. So I knew how they act with and without their parents. This is a pretty great lab I had to look at this, even though I didn't plan. So they also were, without meaning to, mentoring me. Mentoring is great. Mentoring is always well-intentioned, but sometimes with seeing other families candidly that way, and in your own home and in their home and stuff, you can see some bad examples too. Yeah. And because one of the tools that I've helped people with more than anything is make the better choice. And sometimes to make a good choice, you always need to have at least 2 things in mind that you're choosing between. And so having bad examples and good examples is a good way to go, okay, I want to be less like this and more like that.
Yeah, I definitely think that's vital to see that.
So I registered him to homeschool, and then I got the scope and sequence from the public schools to see what it was that we needed to do during that year. And it was just practically nothing, right? Mm-hmm. Needs to walk in a straight line, hop, colors. It was really easy stuff. So I used to look at it every week, and then I looked at it every couple of months, and I forgot all about it. So when he was going to be in first grade, I said, what do you want to do? Do you want to stay home? I named some of the other kids, or do you want to go to school? Named some kids. And he said, I want to stay home. Okay. But we assumed that the next boy would still want to go to school because he was very sports oriented, competitive, physical, and we thought he's going to need to go to school and be with other kids. But he used to say, yeah, I'm going to go to school. So we were not saying we are a homeschooling family. We'd say Kirby doesn't go to school. And then one day we were at the grocery store and a little old lady asked, as they do, whoa, is school out today? Why aren't you in school? And Marty was sitting in a big part of the cart, and he was 3, I think, or maybe 4. And he sort of raised himself up and said, just full voice to this woman, we're homeschooled. And I thought, well, Marty's in. So that's how I found out Marty didn't want to go to school. And we thought Holly will want to go to school because she's a fashion queen. She needs to dress up and change her clothes a couple or 3 times a day and then come and show everybody. And she needs to have her hair just so, she's very fashion show girl. And we thought, well, she's going to need an audience. Surely Holly will go to school. And when the time came, she stayed home too. So because each one had a choice and always had a choice to go back to school, that was an advantage that I see a lot of other families miss out on. They fail to see that one of the worst things about school is that the children have no choice but to be there. They feel trapped. They feel helpless.
Yeah.
And so if a family says, the parent says, I hate school, so I will never put my kids in school. They'll never see the inside of a school, be over my dead body. And some people just go quite dramatic about the whole thing. The problem with that is now their kids are trapped. And what if something happens to the parents? Or what if the parents just don't make it as homeschooling parents and the kids need to go to school? And the parents have sort of reviled school and scared the kids about it. I never wanted to do that. I always told them, yeah, here's a good thing about school. Yeah, if you were in school, you could do this. I wasn't trying to sell it to them. I was just trying to keep a fairly even balance about it.
Maybe show them the options, different things like that.
In case they wanted to go.
Yeah.
And because I did like it. Both my husband and I had one weird thing. Both of us kind of like, this is sad. They won't be in marching band.
Yeah.
Because my husband and I both had really enjoyed that, group, group music. But we'd been in marching band. You can do choir, you can do vocal music outside of school, but you can't do marching band. But I think our kids wouldn't have anyway. And it's just amusing that was our big stumbling block. For some people, it's prom. What if they don't go to the prom?
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Each of my kids went to a school dance. One was a prom, one was a winter dance, and one was a homecoming dance. Just by chance, we didn't set it up. It just so happened that each of them was invited to go do something by a school kid. And they all had bad stories, not horrible stories, just like that it was a little lame, that the other kids were very immature. Yeah, it was kind of silly. Holly's group went in a limousine, and they didn't save any money to go out to dinner, so they got the limousine to drive through McDonald's, which I wish there were photos of, but there aren't.
That's funny.
So it was easy for me to choose unschooling because of those 2 families who had already shown me how peaceful it could be, how good the relationships could be between the parents and the children.
Well, and I'd really love it if you would define unschooling for us and how that's different than homeschooling, maybe what they look like individually.
Unschooling is about the environment that you create. It's like the open classroom without being limited to the classroom or the school schedule. So all of the research that the school reform researchers, professors, teachers did in the 1960s and the 1970s all supports unschooling. And their vision of creating a rich environment and letting the children choose when and how to do things totally fits unschooling, except that they still had a curriculum. They were required to provide grades and some sort of measurements. And they were required to have school years. So they had to finish some things by the end of the year, right? But you don't need that with unschooling. And I think people who think back to their own childhood and their own learning, I think they realize and they figure out that understanding concepts or getting enthusiastic about something doesn't take 16 weeks or, it doesn't take a unit. It takes an instant. When you understand something, you understand it suddenly.
Yeah.
But school is running an assembly line. They need to keep all the kids together in the room. And so I know as a teacher that one of the ways that teaching works is you present the information to 30 kids, you're aiming it at the middle 10. When you stand up there to say something, 10 of them already know and 10 of them don't care.
Wow. Yeah.
And so everything gets said again. You know they don't remember what they said the year before because 10 of them already knew, 10 of them didn't care. Those poor kids who already knew, they're hearing it over and over and over. But every one of them who does get it, gets it once. They understand it once.
That's interesting.
And so it doesn't take school years, and it doesn't take units, and it doesn't take courses. It takes exposing them to enough ideas and interesting things that they start to make their own connections. They start to form their own, I've used this phrase a lot, model of the universe. They start to figure it all out and map history and science and social life and all the connections that in school are separated, in the real world are not separated.
Yeah.
If you know when Mozart was by any clue, by costume or the music, or by just because you have timelines in your head, or because you know something about the politics or the technology of violin production, or when operas, what, it doesn't matter why you know. In school, it matters why you know, because they'll tell you, memorize this. And if you're in a history class, they don't want to talk about science. If you're in a history class, they don't want to talk about music. If you're in a music class, they don't want to talk about history and science. But in the real world, all these things are so related that it doesn't even make sense to separate them. And in fact, when Kirby was little, I consciously and purposefully did not ever use the words science, history, language arts, grammar. I didn't use any of those school terms when he was little because I didn't want him to know that rocks and space and worms are, quote, the same thing, because they really are. And in school, kids will decide early on. They'll be little kids, 8 years old, 10 years old, and they'll say, I hate science, or I don't like history, because they didn't like one thing. If a kid doesn't like to hear about World War I, it doesn't mean he doesn't like knights and castles. And so categorizing things in schoolish ways creates one of the worst parts of a school environment, too.
Yeah. Well, and I remember when I was out in the real world, once I got released from school, I remember having a hard time relating everything, that life didn't fit in neat little boxes like I was taught in school. And I had a really hard time trying to adjust to that, that it took a little while for me to understand like everything flows. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And when my kids were little, critics, friends, people who wanted to figure out what the heck we were doing would say, well, how are they going to learn to live in the real world?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's the greatest question. I just say, well, they are in the real world. It's the school kids who aren't in the real world.
Yeah.
But the open classroom didn't work in public schools. That was introduced, especially in Albuquerque. Albuquerque had a lot of open classroom stuff going on because there was a textbook written by professors at UNM, the University of New Mexico. And Albuquerque public schools were way into it. I think there was probably research money involved, and there were some school buildings created, several elementary schools in town, they're still there, created on a physical model of how an open classroom building ought to be. And so they did this, and they said, starting next year, this school is open classroom. But the teachers who had already been hired, and some of them had tenure, it wasn't their decision. They weren't into it. They wanted to do what they had already been doing. They already felt like teachers weren't making very much. In the 70s, that was so true. And still, but they didn't want to change what they already knew and what they were already doing. And so the parents were like, what do you mean? What do you mean they have options? Just make them do it. And the kids were, we have choices. Woohoo.
Yeah.
We don't have to read right now. Woohoo. We're not gonna, because the kids had been trained to do what parents made you do what adults made you do, and don't do what they don't make you do.
Yeah.
To just tell them now it's going to be, it didn't work. So those buildings now they've built walls out of filing cabinets and bookshelves, and the rooms that were intended for certain, science room or whatever, it's just a regular classroom.
Wow. So
it's like a ghost town of the intention of open classroom.
So what I'm kind of getting with the definition and the difference between homeschooling is that unschooling really lets the child definitely lead the education, whereas homeschooling is still at kind of back to the schoolish type of mindset of, somebody's telling you what to do. And how do you create an environment? Is that correct?
No, I don't like lead, and I don't like education. Education is something that's already pre-decided and pre-formed that someone is supposed to insert into you. And I don't think that anyone needs to lead if the home environment and the family is living in such a way that learning is happening all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and that's maybe where people would struggle is because, I mean, we are kind of taught, many of us have gone to school, and that we are kind of taught that there are specific places that you do school. School looks a certain way. School is these particular things. How does a person kind of help to change that philosophy? I mean, we've heard the word deschooling a lot, but, how do people deschool themselves to kind of create that more natural learning experience where there's just opportunity for that wherever?
It takes a while. When I was first around homeschooling, they said deschooling is going to take a month for every year that you were in school. And that was even just for school at home purposes. For unschooling, it's another step further, because even though the children might have only been in school for just a little while, the parents were probably in school for at least 13 years, sometimes 20. And if a family, if the parents went to school, kindergarten, all of high school, 4 years of college, and then they homeschooled for a while, all of those years are years that person was just embedding this school schedule and school expectation and school behavior into their bones.
Yeah.
And so it takes longer for them to recover. So a kid who's in school for 2 years and the parents take him out, by Christmas, he's like, let's do it. Let's go. And the parents are still saying, okay, well, when are you going to lead some education? They're assuming that the child is somehow going to reproduce school for fun. And that's not how it works at all. So until those parents know that mathematics doesn't look like a page with, I'm going to use this in quotations with my fingers, problems, with the problems on it, with little numbers lined up for you to do some calculations with, then they won't know what it looks like. They won't know what mathematics is like in the wild. They won't know how to find language that's not a page with 10 questions or with 10 sentences that you parse or underline the subject, if that's what they think English looks like. If they think history looks like a textbook that has one chapter for however many 16 things in order, they won't know. They won't be able to help their children learn naturally because they don't know what natural learning is like in the regular world. So it is possible that if the parents hang around with other unschoolers and if they make the effort to figure this out, they can do it. There are several articles on my site, lots of things on my site. But if they don't have the desire to change, they can't. They won't.
Yeah.
And unschooling won't work. Few adults desire to change because they've been promised since they were little, you can do this when you're 10, you can do this when you're 15, you can do this when you're 18, 21, and then you just sail until you're 65 and you retire. As though from 21 to 65, there's nothing new to learn. There's nothing you have to do. And it's not true.
Yeah.
But unless they're willing to give up their little dream of adults can do whatever they want to and don't have to do anything, which is also a symptom that they need to deschool, right? Because they're still living on that promise that they have been clinging to since they were kids. Until they want to give that up, that frustration that they grew up with will just still be a part of the way they are. So without wanting to change, unschooling is inaccessible. But you used the phrase more natural learning experience at some point.
A summary basically on Sandra's website is unschooling and mindful parenting, which that sounds like those two definitely go hand in hand, with hundreds of practical ideas of how to move from schoolish things to live a life of natural learning and joy. So yeah, I definitely put that in there on purpose because, I wanted to talk about that. I mean, what was maybe some of your biggest obstacles? I mean, you definitely had some great role models and you knew what you didn't want, maybe what you did want, but what were those obstacles? I mean, did you, assuming you had a period of deschooling as well?
A more natural learning experience was in one of the questions that you sent me, and I think that it's insufficient to just have a more natural learning experience. You need to go all the way. That's only the starting place. Because when people say, well, that was more natural, okay, but is it sufficient to sustain itself for 10 or 12 years? And so that's the kind of deschooling that needs to be done, where the parents themselves are starting to learn too for fun and effortlessly and continuously. It can be so cool once that starts happening, but it's hard to get it to start. And once it starts, it's so fun that no one would stop. once it's going well. So I didn't really have obstacles. I didn't struggle. You asked me at one point what I had learned from struggles, but I don't struggle. And I recommend that people wanting to live more peacefully avoid that word and that idea of struggle or of seeing things as obstacles, because too often people will say things like, oh, I'm battling this, or I'm struggling through, and that sets them as martyrs against obstacles and evils of the world around them. And it might make them feel stronger, but more likely it's going to make them feel powerless and victimized and resentful.
Before we go on, please listen to these messages. Recently, the Luminous Mind became an affiliate for EduSense, which offers tremendous discounts on educational supplies. I personally use EduSense to purchase our family supplies because of their great prices, responsive shipping times, and best of all, the chance to earn EduBucks, which I use towards future purchases. Who doesn't love a great deal within a deal? To get a 90% savings on your EduSense materials, go to theluminousmind.net and click on the sponsor page to find the affiliate link. Start using EduSense to illuminate your educational experience. Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Sandra Dodd, who's helping us see that everything counts.
My son and I were actually kind of talking about that. A lot of those negative emotions kind of get a bad rap of sadness or fear or, anger or frustration. I mean, we all are trying to stay away from that, like you were talking about, stay away from that struggle, stay away from the hard stuff. But that's just all part of life. Those are natural, normal emotions that you're supposed to feel.
I disagree.
Oh.
If you say, I'm struggling with unschooling, well, stop struggling. And if you see it as, I'm working on doing this, I want to do this, I'm changing, I'm making decisions, we're playing with unschooling. Play with it. Don't struggle with it.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, how do you feel like your paradigm or educational philosophy changed over time and with experience through this time of your life?
I was confident in the beginning, partly because when I was in college, they taught me about alternative education in the open classroom. And when I was a teacher, I didn't use the textbook. I used other things I made, games, dictionaries. And so I knew that it could be done. I had a head start there. And the facts about how people learn and what harms learning and what helps have not changed, won't change, can't change. So it was easy for me, and because it was Kirby, bright, curious, gamer boy, really easy to deal with, and we had that advantage of not having any pressure when he was young. I used to read a magazine that came out in those days called Growing Without Schooling. It had been founded by John Holt, who had died a few years before that, and it came out every 2 months, and it was the only resource for unschoolers when I started, and I used to read it cover to cover and then wait 2 more months. That helped. Being around other unschoolers, those other 2 families helped.
Let's talk about your book, The Big Book of Unschooling. What was the inspiration behind writing that? And
I already had one. In 2005, I gathered up my published articles that had been in various newsletters, magazines, all over the place, but I gathered them all up and put them in order and put them in a collection called Moving a Puddle, which is the name of one of the essays. And a couple of years after that, an unschooling mom from India named Hema Bharadwaj, who had come to visit me and I later went to visit her, said, "You really ought to have a book that summarizes your whole website." And so that was the inspiration for the Big Book of Unschooling, which is almost 350 pages.
Oh, wow.
It has a beautiful cover that my daughter did when she was a teen, just one of the prettiest pieces of art. And I thought that I could easily go through the web page and find enough of my own writing to just cut and paste. But some of the pages that had the most important topics were too long, just really long, or they were exchanges that were saved from discussions, or it was someone else's writing. I had saved the good parts of what other people had written over the years. So I would have to summarize it myself anew. So a lot of the writing in Big Book of Unschooling is new. Some of the reviews I've seen online said, oh, it's just the same as her website. It's not. At least half the book is new writing, and it's some of my best. I've had requests over the years for people to translate it into other languages, but I've always said, sorry, you can't. And that stuns them. They're like, why? I really want to. It's like, no, not that you can't translate, but because I'm so interested in words and thought, how particular English words affect thought. Yeah, see what I've picked on during this discussion is like, well, I wouldn't say lead, well, I wouldn't say struggle. Because if you can hold a word in your mind, in your heart, and use that word, and it affects how you can think. It limits your thought. And that's behind a lot of what I have discovered and used and passed on about unschooling is if you use happier terminology, clearer terminology, it's easier to understand. If you cling to ideas that are schoolish or ideas that are negative or ideas that will limit you seeing what is possible in the larger context, then you can't get there. So sometimes people just really need to let go of ideas like they need to not say teaching. They need to not say taught himself and things like that. Because if you think you need to be taught even by yourself, then you're stepping away from the flow of natural learning. So the books don't translate because it's about a particular word in English. There's a section on my site that talks about that in French, about one article that was being translated, and it was the difference between teaching and learning, and it didn't really translate well in French. Also, in my book, each page suggests a web page for more reading, and the web page is in English. Although there are sections of collected translations or links to translations of my stuff or of things on my site that are other places in 8 other languages, and I will name them so that people won't go looking for 8 languages that are not there. French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Dutch, Italian, Chinese, and Japanese. That people have just voluntarily grabbed something up, translated it, sent me a link, or sent me the text. And so there's quite a bit. Those were in the order of quantity. Italian, Chinese, and Japanese are sparse, but those others, there's quite a bit.
Wow. Sounds like you're really affecting the world. I mean, with your thoughts and writings, they're so interested that they're wanting to translate it. Is that
right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's true. My book is really good for people who are already absolutely certain that they want to unschool. Oh. It's not an introduction. It's not like, what is unschooling? I mean, it kind of can be, but it's not persuading people who think unschooling is a bad idea to want to unschool. I don't want to persuade anybody to unschool who thinks it's a bad idea. Uh-huh. They need to really find it on their own and really want to do it because it's the only way it can work.
Yeah.
So I'm not selling it. I don't make anything when people decide to unschool. I don't lose a customer or a client. It's not like I'm a vacuum cleaner salesman. And then if I don't persuade you right now that you're going to go buy a Dyson and not a Kirby or whatever. Yeah, Kirby comes to mind just because I have a kid named that. But I didn't name him after a vacuum cleaner. I named him after my dad, whose name was Kirby Adams. For newest beginners, reading online or listening to the podcasts at unschoolingsupport.com, which is a series Amy Childs did, or the books on Pam Laricchia's webpage, are more basic introductions. That's where people can go to decide whether they think it's a good idea or not. But my book is really for a deeper understanding. And the format makes it really good for a bathroom book or a nightstand book because most of the topics are 1 page long and you don't need to read it in order. And each page does have a link to more. So if you read a page and like, yeah, I don't care, don't need it, but you get to the next page and like, this is what I need, there's a link right there, an easy link. Most of the links on my site are sandradodd.com/something obvious, really obvious. And so it's easy to go to that site and guess. And if you guess wrong, it'll give you a search box. So it's an easy site to get around. It's big, though. It's really, really big.
That's why it's called the Big Book of Unschooling.
Yeah, the Big Book of Unschooling is very tiny compared to that website.
Well, I'm about ready to use another bad word of, struggle, but sometimes people just assume that unschooling is just easier than homeschooling. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends. I think that's the only defensible answer to most questions of comparison, though, is it depends. It depends on the parents' abilities and personalities. Some people don't want to or can't. If their goal is to hothouse their kids and to keep them on the cultural assembly line, but to work harder and faster, and then the only thing that's going to work for them is school at home. They shouldn't even think about unschooling because it doesn't lead to the same goal in the same time. School at home So I want to warn people too, might as well get a warning from me since I got this far into an unschooling interview. School at home can do most of the damage that school does and more. So there's no magic about homeschooling that prevents the school damage. Don't try this at home is a really good thought to have about school, because if school's methods worked, let the professionals do it. If school's methods don't work, they're not going to work at your house either.
Oh, I love that. I mean, it can cause more damage, kind of what you're saying. I mean, then you lose the relationship with the child. I mean, that's,
Yes.
I think that's one thing. I was kind of inspired when you're talking about the difference between the two types of families. You know, the unschoolers had very loving relationships with their kids, treated them kindly. The children treated the parents kindly, and the homeschooling or school at home type of parents were still very authoritarian and telling their children, you know, what they should do. The relationships were bad. I mean,
They were.
Yeah.
And when the unschooled kids would come over to my house, they were still sweet, happy, curious, fun. And when the school at home kids would come over, they'd kind of go wild because the rules at their house were so many and so strict that when they got to a place where there weren't so many rules, they didn't know how to act.
They couldn't rule themselves. I mean, they couldn't take care of themselves.
Yeah. I'm not in favor of ruling themselves either, but they didn't have the calm that was being bred and developing in the unschooled kids. The calm stability of being part of the world. They weren't held in and controlled to the point that when the parents let go, they launched themselves far away. They were just right where they really were, where they were in themselves. It's hard to describe, but I know you've seen it in some people. I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
So sometimes kids learn to avoid their teachers in school or even to despise their teachers, but then they get to go home for a break where people are nice to them and they love them. But what if they already are home? And then where are they going to go for a break?
Yeah.
So that's another difference. Unschooling doesn't develop that problem, especially if the kids have a choice to go to school. I know a lot of unschooled kids who wanted to try school, and they go, and sometimes for a year, sometimes for part of a year, sometimes for a month, and they go, well, that was interesting. I'm coming home now. And their stories are sometimes similar to those my kids told about school dances. They're disappointed that the kids don't want to be there. They're not curious. They're not working. They don't want to learn. And the parents who went to school already expected that, but the kids who didn't go to school don't. They seem to be surprised by that. And if they avoid their teachers and despise them and those teachers are their parents, then the negative effects could last a lifetime. They can affect the grandchildren too, in more ways than one. By the way, the parents have modeled, have accepted or copied what their parents did, and also by the possibility that they won't want the grandkids to be around the grandparents. So having a really good relationship within the family is an investment in the future, all kinds of ways. Investment in the next generation. And if you have multiple children, you have multiple grandchildren, that's a lot of lives that could be adversely affected by parents. But, you have an opportunity, you have one window to do this. You don't get to do it again.
That is very true. I mean, the one shot of helping your children or being there with them. And yeah, I love that. I
think if you waste it on trying to control them, trying to make them do things, trying to tell them what they have to do, then they will turn off the radio. They will stop recording you. They will not take in your information, whatever analogy you want to use. You have access to them. You can be influential, but you only have so many chances to mess it up before you're gone. You are no longer a legitimate influence on them. And some parents use that up by saying, no, you can't do it like this, sit like this, eat this, and eat it like this. That by the time the kids are old enough to have asked them some questions about important life decisions, those aren't the people they're asking.
Yeah, they don't feel safe there for sure to ask really vulnerable questions for sure.
So unschooling takes a lot of work and effort to understand right at the beginning. And I've seen people fail to get it because they were cocky and they thought they knew everything, or because they heard a little bit of what unschoolers told them. They're like, yeah, I get it. I understand it. And they thought that somehow they were exceptions to the needing to deschool rule. They thought, I don't need to deschool. So then what? It's like, no, if you don't deschool, you can't do it. Or they think that because they have a degree in education, they get a buy, that they get to move to the front of the class. And that's sometimes a detriment, not an advantage.
Oh, yeah.
So when someone is not willing to go all the way, they just can't possibly get there. But once it's established and flowing, once the whole family all year, day and night, weekends, every day. Once that's flowing, I think unschooling is easier and more productive. But if you can't get it to flow, it's not going to work.
Yeah, it sounds like there's definitely less contention or, less negative feelings between parents and the children for sure. What do you feel like are some really important personal habits that are helpful to success for unschooling?
Personal habits sounds like a question about cleanliness or punctuality.
Yeah.
But for me, I think living so that my children and others could respect me and trust me has been the most valuable. When I make decisions, part of the basis on which I make those is this what a better person would do? Is this a good thing to do for a good person to do? And the personal traits that have helped me be a good unschooling mom are openness, honesty, curiosity, and humor. I think humor is a big one. I like lots of kinds of music. I encouraged my kids to sing around the house and in the car for fun. We sang together, parody stuff, humor, harmonies. And I think it's fun to help other people find connections to what they're interested in. We live joyfully and sweetly as much as we can at our house, even now that my kids are all grown. For a few years, one of them lived 700 miles away. He was in Austin and we're in Albuquerque. And another has lived various places in New Mexico and outside for months at a time, 6 months, 2 months. But these days, they're all very nearby, and that's helpful.
Yeah, I love the idea that you can live joyfully and sweetly and wonderful. What do you feel like, what mentors along the way did you feel like had a significant difference in your success?
Success is a difficult topic. I could answer better about learning.
Yeah. That goes back to one of those words again that kind of has a negative,
Because
who defines success? Yeah.
It's not just who, it's when, at which point.
Yeah.
It was my best friend when I was growing up, lived in the nicest house in town, and her dad was a doctor, and then he was in prison for a while.
Wow.
And I've known a lot of people who were slow starters, hesitant, or troublemakers who grew up to be great providers for families. I have one friend who was so involved in sex and drugs and stupidity, I thought he's just not even going to live to be any older. And he has become one of the best husbands to his wife I've ever seen. So I don't think wherever you see them, you can say this is success, but that's only good on the day they die, because the next day they could totally botch it, or the other way around. So there are influences and inspirations on everybody, good ones and bad ones. But for me, the two people that I credit the most are Carol Rice and Lori Odner. They were both La Leche League leaders when my oldest was a baby. And they were very inspirational to me in a lot of ways. They said things I still remember and do, and they were the two unschooling moms too, although I did not know it, that when I met them. I didn't know it through that whole series of the first meetings that I went to. I had no idea because that wasn't the topic. I was a mom with a little baby. And later on, turns out those two leaders of the first meeting I ever went to were also unschooling moms. So it's kind of hard for me looking back to know which was what. Yeah. So they changed my life in very large ways.
That's great.
At conferences, sometimes I've run workshops about gratitude. That's officially about gratitude, but it's kind of about something else, where I ask them to name someone who said or did something that was a turning point in their lives that they think of sometimes as an inspiration. And they've named particular people, sometimes a teacher or a friend, a relative, a neighbor, or a stranger who did or said something. And then I remind them that they might someday be that person to someone else if they haven't already been. So it's about gratitude and humility, about being aware as we live our candid lives, going to the store, driving around, taking care of our kids at a park, that others are learning from what we do and say.
Well, and like you were talking about, you can learn from good examples, bad examples. I mean, and I love the idea that these women taught you more than just, about breastfeeding or something like that, that you were able to watch their whole lives and that affected you in a different way. So let's talk about maybe like what your long-term vision is and how you hope to serve others in the future. It sounds like you have done an amazing job. I think we somewhat skipped over what you're already doing, but I feel like we kind of touched on it with all the big book of unschooling and all the things that we can find on your blog, and then the way that people have taken that and translated into so many different languages. But what does it look like for down the road for you?
Well, I never did have a long-term vision. I was just doing what needed to be done that day. I was living with my children each day, helping them do interesting things, and then answering other people's questions about what we were doing. So my greatest service now is to answer questions and provide resources to the people who come to my discussions to learn more about unschooling. I have a discussion on Facebook and one on Yahoo Groups. The Yahoo Groups discussion was started in 2001, and the Facebook group has been there since 2010.
Wow.
So
I'm going to have to
there
get the
every
link.
day.
Yeah, get the link for the Yahoo group too. I don't think we talked
They're
about
on the unschooling page. If they go to sandradodd.com and then click on unschooling, they're both linked there. That's what I do, is I answer questions.
That's great. And how do you feel like that's going to work into your legacy? I mean, what do you see that being, where you're answering questions, you're helping other people? I mean, is that kind of where you're going to be thought of as that lady?
I don't know. I'm leaving a pretty extensive collection of good parts of discussions over the years. Even before these two discussions I mentioned, I've been online since there were user groups. There was a user group on homeschooling. Got a lot of practice there answering questions from Christian school at home people in the 90s, when that was a big fad, a huge wave of fundamentalist Christian homeschoolers were in a group. There were, of 80 homeschooling families in that, about 60 of them were that new wave of Christian homeschoolers who had been told that they invented homeschooling. So those of us who had read John Holt's books from the 60s and 70s are like, I don't think you did.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you did. But I got so much practice answering questions there. And some of the things that are still quoted came from those days and from AOL and from forums long gone. So there are several forums that were rich and wonderful. And when they started to die, I started collecting the gems.
Yeah.
And I have those on my webpage. So there are over 2,000 pages on unschooling and parenting there. But by page, I don't mean like if you hit print, it's one page. Some of those URLs would print out to 10 pages or more.
Wow.
So it's like somebody said it's like Wikipedia of unschooling. And they were trying to be insulting when they said it. But I'm like, yeah, so it's fine. So as to legacy, some of that will still be around when I'm gone. I hope my friends and family will keep up the annual payments on that website and my photo storage, because if they don't, it could be harder to get to. But that's the main thing, is the collection of ideas, which is still being added to all the time. I work on those web pages every couple of days, and there's also a blog that has updates on what's new there that people can subscribe to, and that's called aboutunschooling.blogspot.com. I can email you these links.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Still, some people don't listen. Some people just listen to the podcast and they don't look at the page.
Yeah.
So most of this can be found pretty easily from sandradodd.com.
Okay, awesome. Okay, I know we're going to definitely talk about that as we close up. But before we say goodbye, do you have any final parting words or maybe a favorite quote that you like to share? And then give us your contact information, how we can get in touch with you.
A common school kid question, I know this from being a teacher and also from being a kid, is somebody's talking and the kid will say, does this count? Is this going to count? Because they don't want to spend time or effort on something that isn't going to count. So one of the best things I probably ever said or written is 2 words long, and here it is. Everything counts. If school and grades form the object and life is the field, an object and field ideas, then many things don't count. Unless it's school, it doesn't count. Trivia doesn't count. It's not on the test. But when you live without school or schoolishness, everything counts. In learning, in relationships, concerning integrity, everything counts. I think a good page for people to go to would be sandradodd.com/feedback, FEEDBACK, small letters. Because there are things that people have written to me that I've saved, and there's also a place where they can write to me if they need to. They can make comments about this, or I guess they'll be doing that on your blog. But that's a good starting place. And then sandradodd.com is another good starting place. There's a page called Beginning and a page called Help. Then when I say called, it's like sandradodd.com/beginning or help. And those are collections of things for new unschoolers that'll help them get started.
That's great. I really do feel like the crux of our whole conversation has been, if you want to keep your children from going to school, what kind of relationship are you going to have with them within that
idea? Are we going to have relationships that really, where everything, I love how everything does count, every time that you have, I've had different people come on and talk about how you have to take the teacher hat off and just be the mom, just be mom, where people feel, and hopefully when we hear the word mom, it means that you have a feeling of admiration and love for that person because of the relationship that you've cultivated with either allowing somebody just to be who they are, or are we going to pound, our ideas and thoughts into somebody and then have a relationship that doesn't create those great feelings. At least that's kind of what I've gotten from this whole conversation, is that, it's more about those relationships and having wonderful experiences together than it is to just, hopefully learning. Like we've talked about, goes with everything, but that's kind of what I got out of our conversation. Again, Sandra's contact information is sandradodd.com, but we're going to be sure to link all the information that we've discussed today on our website as well. But thank you so much, Sandra, for joining us and helping to light our minds on fire on this really important topic of natural learning with our children and unschooling. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Sandra Dodd, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list. Then check out the Services tab to see how we can continue to assist you, our fire starters. Also, to help us continue production of illuminating content, go to the Sponsor tab at theluminousmind.net for more information on sponsorship and affiliate programs. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and now Instagram. Get our free audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider these easy ways. Tell your friends about us, leave us a review, share our content, tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.